Just sit in the seat and we'll get started.
Okay.
Really?
Great, thank you very much. My name is Richard Katz, and I'm going to be your moderator for this panel on disruption and transportation. We're going to try and focus most of this time on questions and answers. So rather than introduce all the speakers, there's things in your notebooks about everybody, or they can tell you a brief one sentence when we call on them. Second, if you have a question, please make it short. If you want to give a speech, there's a free speech area just outside the quad down there that I would appreciate your going to so we can ask questions. Couple quick thoughts. A lot of people in LA think that because they voted for something, they've done their part. I voted for the money for the homeless, so I don't have to cite one in my neighborhood. You hear that often. You also hear a lot of people think that going to the meeting is the action item. And we have to impress upon people it's what happens after the meeting that counts, even though the meeting is helpful. And finally, I want to do one thing that I haven't done for a while, but I'm curious to how many people in this room were not born in Los Angeles? Yeah, see, I do that for two reasons. One, so those of us that were born here, like me and 6 other people, can understand, and Wendy Gruhl, thank you very much, can understand who's causing all the congestion on the freeways. And second, it serves to remind us that we're all part of the problem, so we all have to be part of the solution. So with that, let's start off and with Brian Taylor from UCLA School, Luskin School, public policy, urban planner, transportation expert, blah, 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 but a really good guy too. Brian? Yeah. All yours.
All right. Okay, blah, 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 blah. All right, so I just want to kick things off a little bit talking about the disruptions that we're seeing right now in transportation. We're used to congestion, we're used to the sort of things that have been in place for a long time, but there's a lot new on the scene. This is an exciting time with lots of technological change. Suddenly, bikes and scooters are appearing, and Lyft and Uber are picking people up and dropping people off. The technological innovation is moving quickly, and the private sector is flying along. There's vehicle automation on the horizon. We have clean, increasingly electric vehicles, internet retail, and the rise of small goods movement and delivery, the rapid growth in app-based mobile services. This includes car share, bike share, scooters, microtransit, ride-hailing. And it's a real challenge for government because government isn't designed to move extremely quickly. And it's been a real challenge for how to respond. And one of the things we're thinking about here is what's the public interest in all this new public mobility? So what should be the public role? Well, with respect to automated, connected, electric, and shared mobility, to answer that question, I think we have to ask another one. And that's what's the public interest in mobility more broadly? In absent some clear answer to that, governmental responses can be confused and contradictory and at cross purposes. So if we think about, we've just dealt with the ride-hail revolution since about 2010. We've got scooters before us now, and we're looking at automated vehicles tomorrow. There's a lot to go on. But I think the recent history of ride-hail offers some insight into how we can go about responding to these kinds of changes. And so we can ask, what has been the governmental responses to this new mobility? Well, so far we've seen, I think, 4 things. One is, technology is our savior. Come to our town. Another is, cease and desist. Go away. A third is, well, we'll regulate you heavily. And another is, well, we'll regulate you lightly. Well, there's really a fifth as well, which is, wait, what? Help! What do we do? And that's what we're hearing a lot from government officials is they just don't know what to do that things are moving so quickly. So let's think about these public interests. So first, I think that I want to put 3 points across: economies, externalities, and equity. First, the economy is that transportation is central to economic activity and productivity. And it's a collective action problem in many cases that markets won't take care of on their own. So there's things that the public sector has to get involved in because markets won't provide extensive road systems, for example. The second is externalities. There's a lot of things that come from the private benefit that transportation accrues to travelers, but there's a lot of costs that they impose on society that they're not responsible for paying for. Travelers impose delays on others when you crowd onto the freeway. When you use non-renewable resources, you emit pollutants, you impose noise and safety risks on others. These are all things that typically travelers don't pay for, but society does. And the third is equity, is that transportation burdens and benefits are not distributed fairly, and they should be in a normative sense. And these are three important rationales for why the public sector should get involved in all of this private mobility. So what's not in the public interest? Well, this is a little editorializing. Regulatory capture, which is how do we protect the existing businesses that we're regulating now from these new competitors? A second is holding newcomers to higher standards. We don't want to affect people driving around now. They've got their cars. They should be able to park where they want. But these newcomers, they're creating the problems. And the third is we just don't like these new firms. They're not nice people, and we don't want to deal with them either. And these are things that are often used as rationales which are on shakier ground than the previous that I mentioned. I want to make one proposition, and then we can go forward. I think many, though not all, fears about new mobility by those in the public sector, such as Uber, AVs, of greatly increasing vehicle travel, congestion, and emissions, are not really about new mobility at all. They're instead a product of our unwillingness to intelligently manage our current atomized private vehicle-centered transportation system. That's the problem that we don't want to confront. So we think about what's going to be in the future we have to deal with. We got things we can cope with right now. So just a little bit, at UCLA last year, we launched a new mobility initiative in the Institute of Transportation Studies. We had our Lake Arrowhead conference last fall was on this topic. We had a downtown event, which was also on the topic of new mobility. We're part of a UC-wide, system-wide ITS initiative, and we're looking to work with partners all around the state on developing a research program to help advise the transitions to all of this new mobility. And so a little plug for what we're trying to do at the Institute to help with this. So that's it. Thank you very much, and we'll get on to the next panelist.
Thank you, Brian. As we start with our panelists, come on up. One of the things to keep in mind, one of the challenges, multiple challenges we have here is, one, everyone who drives in LA thinks they're a transportation engineer. But aside from that, how do you solve today's problem while you're also trying to solve the future's problem and not do today's problem in a way that makes it harder to solve something in the future where technology is changing faster than we can write laws? And with that, Conan?
Great. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Conan Chung from Metro. I run the service planning scheduling department there. And really, here's kind of the obligatory, first slide of the presentation. This is your transit network here. We're the third largest in the country. The big takeaway here is that despite the fact that we continue to grow, especially with Measure R, Measure M, we're seeing a pretty negative decline in terms of our ridership. We've seen over a 20% reduction in boardings. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're not really relevant today for many of the people who want to make their trips. There's a lot more places to go. There's more people. We haven't re-looked at our entire network in probably over 25 years, and that was before the Blue Line, the first light rail line, was built. And of course, relevant to today's talk, there's a lot more ways to get around. So how do we become more competitive? How do we work with our partners in terms of other mobility options to be able to create a seamless system? So the first thing is we wanted to take a look and see who our current riders are and who our potential customers are as well. This slide here shows you sort of a breakdown of people who live in LA. About 7% of the people who live here are very frequent riders. They count on us a lot for all their trips. About 22% ride maybe a couple times a month, maybe for certain types of trips that make sense. About 55% of people ride maybe a couple times a year, maybe to a Dodgers game or something like that. But the point being is that most people in LA County are willing to use transit if it's done right and if it's going where they want to go. So this is an interesting slide here. This is based on our TAP information, our fare collection information. And even though we have a small percentage of frequent riders, they account for a large percentage of our boardings. So every time we lose one of these frequent riders, we're not just losing one boarding, we're losing a significant number of boardings. So there was a study that was done by a university that happens to be in the center of Westwood here. And one of the concluding facts here was that if 1 in 4 of these non-riders or occasional and frequent riders use transit 2 times per month, we would actually almost more than recoup our lost ridership. So our point here isn't the fact that we want people to abandon their cars, come to transit and only use transit. We're trying to create a better transit network so that you can use us more often for more purposes. So another first step, we had to go out and figure out what people want. And we did a pretty extensive survey. Long story short, no matter how we cut the data, by types of riders, gender, ethnicity, demographic, socioeconomic factors, everyone wants fast, frequent, and reliable service. But what that does is it's only half the battle. That only gets us into contention as a viable transportation mode. Then we have to attract people to use transit, attract people who have a choice. And those are the things in orange over there, which are largely sort of customer experience, user experience types of factors. Safety, security, comfort, ease of use, better information, more real-time information, and so forth. And again, first, last mile, how do we connect up with micro-mobility and so forth? So as good planners, we first go out and try to figure out where people are coming from, where they're going to. We previously looked a lot about population and employment density. We assume that's where people are coming from and going to. You can see where the densities are here on the map. Now, what we did recently is we bought a bunch of cell phone location-based data. We bought about 5 million devices that were traveling around LA County for 6 months. And this is where actually the trips are happening. So you can see there's a sort of a mismatch between where the population employment densities are and where the densities of trips are. But as, again, good planners, we put all of our resources where the population employment densities are. And so therefore, we're sort of misaligned with where a lot of the travel is going on. We took all those data points, the origin to destination points from all of these cell phone devices. We ran it through our trip planner to see how many of these can be made using transit currently. And about 85% of all these trips can actually be made using transit. However, when we run those trips through Google to figure out the highway times, the driving time, you'll notice that there's a big discrepancy between how long it takes you to take transit to make that trip versus how long it takes you to drive that trip. And so that becomes sort of the transit to drive time ratio or the competitiveness of transit relative to driving. So this was sort of one of our first aha moments, is that basically if you look at transit, any of the trips that are that can be made at the same time, within the same time as driving, or faster than driving, let's say, we're carrying a fairly large market share. We're carrying about 13%. But as we get slower compared to driving, we start losing that market share quite a bit. So you can see here, we really want to be competitive. We don't want to be more than 2.5 times slower than driving. If not, we're only capturing people who really have no choice. Now, this was another aha moment. A lot of times we focus our services on peak hours, on weekdays, and that's really going after that commute market. Commute markets are generally longer distance during the peak hours, and so the 10-plus mile trips that you see here, we're carrying, again, our highest market share, about 6%. But that only accounts for 16% of all travel that happens in LA County. And we didn't know that until we started looking into the cell phone data, because there's a lot of short distance trips that you're making, either to the stores or to the daycare or whatever. So when you add in about the 5 miles to 10 plus miles, that's only a third of the travel that's happening, but that's where we're focusing our resources and our energy. So if we refocus ourselves and try to attract the large bubble there, which are the shorter distance trips, we can actually capture quite a bit of a market share. In this case, if we can actually capture 6% of that market share, we would almost double our ridership in terms of linked trips throughout the network. Now, this was another aha moment. Again, we put a lot of resources during the peak hours, so we have more frequent services during the peak hours, less frequent during the middle of the day, and so forth. And that sort of trends, if you look at the orange in terms of our service levels, that trends with the commute trips, the light blue bars. But again, all of those other trips that people are making, a lot of them happen during the midday into the PM and into the evening, and that's right when we start reducing the services. So again, misaligned with the time of day in terms of when people travel. So we need to really realign that as well. And then I think, this one's I'll try to go through this slide pretty quickly. We took all those origin destination pairs, sort of aggregated them into 80 zones throughout the area, and basically we did a quadrant analysis. So each of these dots is an origin to destination pair. If you look at the upper left, this is where we have a good share, we have a good market share over 8% market share, and we're very competitive. We're faster than 2.5 times as slow as the car. And so these are areas or trips that we're actually doing well, so how can we improve ourselves? The next one is, to the upper right, is where we have good market share, but we're not competitive. And what that's saying is that these people are still using us, even though we're not competitive, probably because they don't have another choice. And so we need to make sure that we maintain good service for these individuals. The poor share but competitive, what that's telling me is that even though we're very competitive, we're less than 2.5 times slower than cars, we're not carrying a lot of the market share. So that means that these are people who either don't want to use transit or we're not attractive. Again, those orange things that I showed you. Maybe people don't feel safe or people don't feel comfortable on our buses and our trains. And really the playground that we really want to work on is this lower right. This is where we have a poor market share because we're not that competitive. So how can we become more competitive to move those dots into the upper left corner there? And so when you talk about being competitive, you're really talking about the overall transit journey. And that includes the walk or ride or roll time to get to the bus stop, and then the waiting time. Then you have the onboard time, which is onboard vehicles. So for long distance trips, you're on the bus you're on the bus longer than you are walking and waiting at the bus stop. So these are the types of trips, if we're trying to track these trips, we want to increase the travel speed, the transit priorities, signal synchronization, bus lanes, and so forth. But when we're going after these shorter distance trips, we're really talking about the wait and the walk time that's actually more important. So that's, again, first, last mile. How can we coordinate better with other mode choices like micromobility? How do we create better sidewalks and walking environments, working with the cities? And how do we increase, this is where we need to increase frequency so that your wait time is much shorter. And so sort of our major discoveries to date, really two things. The existing network is really misaligned with the current market demand, both in terms of time of day, the trips that we're trying to serve, and where we're actually putting a lot of our investment. And then it's really all about the complete transit experience. It's not about just onboard the vehicle. It's about how you decide from walking out your door that I want to use transit to getting to the bus stop and then getting on the bus and getting to your final destination. Thank you.
Hi. Our next speaker is Jana Smith, who is not Selena Reynolds, as you would know, but Jana is representing LA DOT, and welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. So my name is Jana Smith, and I work with the Los Angeles Department of Transportation in our Bureau of Transportation Technology. So a lot of this disruption in transportation is our daily bread and butter that we work with all the time, and that includes everything from new advances in vehicle technology, in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and shared mobility advancements that are bringing about a lot of change, not only in the technology that is going into how people travel and affecting how people are changing the vehicles they travel in, but greatly affecting their travel behavior. And that's a lot of what we're trying to address in our work is how do we learn more about how technology is changing travel behavior, and how do we encourage and make sure that all of these changes in travel behavior are not only encouraging more efficient uses of transportation, reducing vehicle emissions, reducing vehicle miles traveled, but serving all sorts of other goals that our department and that the city are aiming for. So again, when you talk about disruption, a lot of these changes came about as surprises for us at LADOT and at other transportation planning agencies, and both out in our right-of-way in the streets and in how we do our everyday business, we've kind of been faced with the challenge of how to fit these new modes, new technology, and new travel behaviors into our existing systems. How do we account for autonomous vehicles or shared mobility devices like dockless scooters in our existing right-of-way, in our existing parking infrastructure, in our existing bike networks that the scooters are using? And additionally, how do we start addressing these changes in our own structure and our own strategies and how we do business as a transportation planning agency and as a city? So our main approaches to that have been not only relying on our existing skills and trying to adapt those to these new technologies and new modes, but also trying to open up lots of open lines of communication and encouraging collaboration to, again, try to find ways to leverage all of these changes to reach our overarching goals as a city. So that involves not only partnering with other cities, again, leaning on some of our existing skills of collaborating with other cities, sharing best practices, sharing lessons learned, and trying to find common goals and ways that we can approach reaching those common goals together, but also collaborating with the private sector partners and stakeholders that are really driving a lot of this innovation. We're seeing lots of private operators and technology companies are the ones who are not only creating new technology, but are creating new business models that are really impacting the way that people get around the city. Again, you see this in things like TNC's Uber and Lyft, or in the dockless shared mobility that's really new over the last couple of years. So that's involved creating lots of new partnerships with folks who weren't really players at the table a few years ago, whether that's new startup companies that didn't exist before, or those were pre-existing and are now entering into a new realm and a new business model and a new way of working with the city. So this involved not only creating new programs and regulations where there were gaps, where things weren't already being addressed, such as putting together a new pilot program to regulate dockless mobility because we didn't have anything on the books that addressed that, but also collaborating with these companies so that the city can learn how best to adapt the way that we work with these companies to make it beneficial for both the private operators and the city who owns and manages the right-of-way in which these operators are doing their business. It's not the same as how we've previously worked with, say, contractors or permitting businesses, permitting ambulance and taxi providers. The businesses are coming from a very different business model and a very different environment that we're kind of having to adapt to. And it's a lot more than just learning the lingo of, technology or startup culture. It's also just learning about what these new business models are aiming for, communicating about what their business goals are, and finding common ground between what their company's goals are and what our city's goals are, and finding ways that our efforts can complement each other and we can find a way to try to reach some of those goals together. Additionally, we've been collaborating with these providers and with other cities on things like we put together a data sharing specification for shared mobility that was created all in the open source. And that included bringing in information and input from other cities such as Santa Monica, Austin, Texas, Portland, Oregon, but also shared mobility providers were collaborating and contributing to the open source development of the specification as well, including Bird, who's visiting us today, Lime, some other stakeholders who aren't a private operator but have a vested interest in shared mobility and the future of shared mobility and data sharing with governments. So it hasn't been just the city going out and creating something and seeing how it works. We've been really pushing to have open communication and collaboration to make sure that, again, everyone's goals are hopefully being met or working towards meeting everyone's goals and finding a way to meet in the middle.
Janet, thank you very much. After this is over, we need to talk about some of those no right turn signs in my neighborhood and the hours and the signalization. But anyhow, next up, Lisa Mendez, and she is with Bird, but more importantly than that, she's a graduate of the Luskin School, which, Gary, does prove you can get work after graduating from here, so welcome. And one thing that's particularly important, and I'd like to just not really correct what all of us sort of think. In LA, it's not first mile, last mile. It's first 2 or 3 miles, last 2 or 3 miles, which makes your product even more interesting.
Great. Hi. This is true. I was trained here at UCLA to think about transportation policy, and so it's really exciting to play a role in what I think is a really exciting conversation about the future of mobility in our cities. I work on the government partnerships team at Bird, which means that I'm the one who often goes into cities to have conversations about how to integrate scooters into the transportation system. And the panel today really is an example of the kind of people that we have been engaging and need to continue engaging in this conversation. We just got a 1-year permit from Los Angeles to operate scooters in the city of LA. And we're really eager to continue partnering with them because, as we all know, what works in Los Angeles will set the model for other cities nationally. And so our partnership with them is a really exciting opportunity to demonstrate how first, last mile, and beyond transportation solutions can work. With Metro, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to really think about how to further connect people to transit. I, for a while, lived a mile from the Red Line, and hate to admit this in a room of planners, but often chose to drive to work because that mile was often an inconvenience to get to the Red Line. And so scooters really are offering an opportunity for us to think about how to reconnect to transit and how to, and we're seeing in other cities as other cities wrap up their pilots that there's a strong relationship between e-scooter use and transit use. And so we're very eager to have a conversation with LA Metro and other cities about how we can further that partnership. And when I do have these meetings with cities, they often ask about best practices and research that can back up further work in mobility space. And so I think places like UCLA really play a key role in playing the role as third-party validators to help cities plan what these future mobility systems will look like. So I will leave it at that so we can have a conversation with the audience, but I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm a huge transportation planner, which is what you become when you go to school at UCLA. And I think that these conversations we're having about disruption and the future of mobility really are going to set the stage for what many of our cities will look like for the next few years.
Great, thank you very much. I did see something scarier the other day than a driver texting. I saw someone on a scooter texting, which really seems to me like playing Russian roulette while you're trying to get from point A to point B. Questions, we have mics at both ends. I see we have a familiar face standing up. Will you kick us off?
Thank you, Richard. I'm Dr. Bonnie Faraday, and I'm up here just to make a brief comment about people with disabilities, particularly hidden disabilities, which would include vision, hearing, and mental illness. So far, I don't qualify for the last stage as far as we know, but I do take public transportation when it's possible for me to do that. And once I'm on it, I'm fine. I don't feel unsafe on the subway or the bus on those occasions, but getting there and getting off is the problem. And I do use Access, and I use City Ride occasionally, but there are some problems with those too. So I just wanted to bring that up to the radar screen because these other modalities are really not helpful for us. And we have an increasing number of people who have this issue, and it's very isolating, particularly if you were a very prolific driver before. So thank you.
Bonnie, thank you. That, we'll all take that as a general comment that all of our modes need to take into consideration, particularly Metro from a planning standpoint and also from an education standpoint, teaching people, to be conscious of everything that's out there and everybody who needs service. Donna Bajarski.
I'm Donna Bajarski. I have a question. Given the fact that we now know that ridership is going down, there's a lot of permutation, but that's the basic. Ridership's going down. We've invested billions in this model. What do you attribute that to, and how does that portend for the future?
Conan, you want to try?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kick it off. I know Brian's got a lot to say about this. But in terms of what we've seen as far as ridership declining, there's probably three basic elements that hit it. First of all, people say we're too slow. When we talk to the people who left the system, they say you're too slow, and I showed a lot of slides about that issue. The second thing is people are saying we're not reliable. And reliability isn't just the reliability of the bus and the train, it's the reliability of information as well. Because nowadays, everyone's used to having apps. You're calling your Uber, your Lyft, and Via, and so forth, and you can see the bus or the car coming to you. That sense of understanding where your transportation is and the fact that it's coming to you is critical, because when our real-time information is not working well, people can't plan their lives around transit, and we're losing a lot of people because of that reliability. And the third one is really, unfortunately, it's the perception of safety and security on our system, and it's inherent in a lot of these larger systems throughout the country, and so we are putting a lot of effort trying to address that issue relative to the customer experience.
Just a couple things I'd add. One is that if you were in the previous session about housing affordability, we're doing some work now statewide that suggests that housing affordability issues are having a big effect on lengthening commutes for especially low-wage workers and pushing them into areas that are maybe less transit-friendly than before. The other thing, Conan was sort of taking it all on for Metro. I think that we have a very conflicted policy regime. We do a lot of things to try and facilitate driving. Right now, the market would love to build at much higher densities between the Santa Monica Pier and Pasadena. And over time, left to its own devices, this area would become more and more friendly to transit and walking and biking, and more hostile to driving. And it's that hostility toward driving and people who are used to driving that want to keep that development from occurring. So we have, in our desire to make things work well for automobiles, I think we're both contributing to a housing affordability problem, and we're making it difficult for Metro's big investments to pay off. And as long as we continue to focus on supporting driving, we're going to be essentially trying to get people on transit with one arm tied behind our back.
At least before you jump in, let me just add one thing to think about. Gentrification has a lot to do with it also. If you think about it, when a neighborhood gentrifies, you're replacing transit-dependent populations with people that can afford cars for the most part. And then it gets really hard to move the train line after the neighborhood changes. So part of the focus needs to be on stabilizing neighborhoods, I think, and as a hedge against gentrification, what we can do to stabilize neighborhoods and keep people and businesses in the neighborhood they want to be in, because it also helps the transportation system that's in place. Go on.
And I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Does it work?
Yeah.
That again, we need to do more research on this and hopefully enter into partnerships with transit agencies to better understand the collaboration opportunities. But there's a huge relationship between e-scooter use and connecting to transit. And so we think that there's a great opportunity for us to make it easier. There's obviously greater forces that affect this issue, but one of them, one of the solutions that we can help provide is making it easier for people to get to transit.
Okay, Wendy Gruhl.
So I have so many questions as a recovering politician and chair of transportation, but I won't ask those.
It's a long
those,
process, isn't it, for both of us?
But two things that have come up recently. One is a consumer, which is, and I am on the LA Homeless Service Authority, the Commission on Homeless Issues, so I recognize this, but I have oftentimes taken it in the evening and has felt more unsafe than it had in the past, that there is a large homeless population that is on there, mentally ill and others, and just what's the plan, and is there a kind of coordination with outreach workers and others to make sure that we have enough people there? My second question is related to safety as well. I serve on I'm a joiner, but I'm on the Women's and Girls Initiative Commission in the county, and one of the things they reported to us is that we are the only region in the country, maybe even in the world, that does not have a policy after a time after like 9 p.m. where if you're riding a bus, instead of getting dropped off at the bus stop per se, but you're a woman that wants to stop closer to their home, that you would be able to have the bus stop at a different location so that you felt safe and were closer and didn't have to walk a far distance, and whether or not that policy has been brought up to the MTA or something we could think about.
Yeah, I mean, related to the first question, homelessness definitely is a big issue on our system, in our stations, at our bus stops even. We are putting a significant amount of effort into it, but with the size of our system, we have, I can't remember how many teams, but we have several teams who go out to outreach to homeless people and try to get them into mentally ill programs and so forth to really try to get them off the street. But unfortunately, as the issue grows, we're not able to grow our forces in line with that growth in homelessness. But we do continue to put a lot of effort on that aspect. As far as the second question, we call them courtesy stops. So people actually are allowed to ask the operator, hey, it's late at night, can you stop at this location, even though it's not a bus stop? We don't necessarily advertise it, but people are allowed to ask for that. The other thing that I've heard a lot from women also again, going back to the real-time information, is that if you have really good real-time information, I know exactly when your bus is going to be at the stop, I can wait in a safe location, especially if you're waiting 20 minutes for a bus or something later in the evening. I can wait in a safe location and come out when your bus is about to be there, so I don't feel sort of vulnerable for the entire duration of my wait.
This side of the question knows. Oh, good. We have a question over here. I thought you guys just knew the answers already. So,
Wait,
yes.
Richard, what's this person's name?
Hi,
You don't know?
Hi, I'm Caitlin Harvey. I am a proud alumni of the School of Public Affairs here and also the Fielding School of Public Health here. I'm a policy analyst through and through. I'm curious to know, with respect to congestion pricing, how you are analyzing harm done to populations, because from what I understand, you're only focusing on, the poorest of our community members here. However, I want to know, are you analyzing how many people in our county live paycheck to paycheck? What is going to be the impact of pricing congestion on them? Because for many people, driving isn't a luxury. We live where we can afford to live. We work where we can afford to work. And we have childcare where we can afford to find childcare. And for many people, taking an extra hour or two on public transit isn't an affordable option. So how are we evaluating the harm done to those people?
As some context, New York and Los Angeles are looking at major pilot projects to test congestion pricing, and it's a policy that has been sort of favored by transportation analysts and loathed by almost everyone else for decades. And one of the concerns that comes up, which is a very important one, is, well, what does it mean when you start pricing road access? What does that mean for low-income people? And I think an important question to ask is, well, relative to what? And how do we pay for the transportation system now, and what would be different if we did this? So what has been the main way that we've been raising money recently is through sales taxes, local option sales taxes for transportation. Sales taxes are exceedingly income regressive. And so because of that, what we've done is we have used a very income regressive tax that disproportionately burdens lower income people to pay for new transportation facilities within the county. It struck me that an area PEEP has been raised about this, which has really been shifting the burden onto lower income people in the process of these now 4 sales tax approvals. The money was very much needed, and this has been the most politically palatable way to do it. People seem willing to pay for that extra half cent. They don't see it as such a big deal, but we are shifting the burden onto lower income people when we do that. We also know that the negative effects of congestion disproportionately affect poor people as well. So low-income people are much more likely to live near a congested freeway. They're more likely to live near a noisy and congested road. And so the extra particulate matter and the costs of those congestions are also disproportionately borne by low-income people. So the question then comes, well, what happens when we have people pay? So a former doctoral student of mine, she's now a professor at UC, Lisa Schweitzer, and I looked at that. We looked at the 91 express lanes in Orange County, which is a congestion-priced roadway where people can pay to bypass congestion. What we found is we asked the question, well, if we paid for that with congestion pricing or we paid with sales tax, how would low-income people be affected? What we found is that the congestion pricing moved the burden off of the very lowest income people and on to middle income people. It also moved burden off of the very wealthiest people and on to middle income people. So in absolute terms, wealthy people paid a bit less, and in relative terms, low income people paid a lot less. Why is that? Well, the people who travel in the peak hour and the peak direction are on average higher income than the people who travel at other times. So people who are lower wage workers tend to commute in all different directions at all different times of day. People who travel in the peak hour and the peak direction tend to be the highest income travelers. So what we can say is that when we go to a congestion fee, it actually has a progressive effect in that it shifts more of the burden off of low income people and onto middle income people who are doing most of the traveling during the peak hour and the peak direction. So these are really important questions to ask, but also really important to kind of analyze what it is relative to what we do now. The last thing I'd say is that what congestion pricing offers that congestion doesn't is the opportunity to then rebate that in the way that we can do with utilities and other things to provide people money back based on their income that could allow to compensate for that. We can't do that when people sit in traffic.
I'm told we have time for one more question now that people have lined up. but also, there's a distinction between managed lanes like the 91 and congestion pricing across the whole city. And in terms of, access, et cetera, because one's just a couple lanes on the freeway and there are non-toll lanes, as opposed to what Metro and others are looking at now, more like the London example of congestion pricing to come into the city.
Right, so there's a number of ways you can do it. One is where you just have these few lanes where on the corridor you have a choice. What's being discussed are what's called cordon area. To enter a certain congested area, you would need to pay a fee. There are other kinds of possibilities that are being looked at, but Richard's actually right. There's many, many ways that this can be implemented, and it can have very differential effects depending on how it's carried out.
The gentleman to my left, his right.
Hi, I'm David Azevedo. I'm with AARP, and when I think of disruption in mobility, I think of automated vehicles. Briefly on, I would have really liked to have been in an automated vehicle from Pasadena this morning, given all the SIG alerts that made my commute a 2.5-hour drive. And we've been doing research on automated vehicles at AARP because of the obvious benefits, both in decreasing driver-related accidents and mortality and injury, and the fact that independence is one of the key focuses that AARP has with older adults, and how AVs...
Is there a question?
Yes. The question is, why aren't we talking more about that? And why are we not talking about a lot of smart infrastructure going to be needed? What's the accountability like? How are we going to pay for that?
Let me, as a paying member of your organization, I mean, you didn't have to start sending me the mail when I was 45, though. It's a long conversation that we don't have time for today, but I think, I don't think we're as close to automated vehicles as many people think we are. For instance, I still am curious as to whose morality is built into the AI that governs those things, because if it's Donald Trump's, I'm not sure that's a good thing. But it's an important question that hasn't been answered yet, along with interoperability of the systems, as every car manufacturer makes their own proprietary system. So there's a lot more to be said about that, at a much longer question and answer. But you want to jump on that one?
I can talk very briefly, yeah. So actually, a lot of our approach to the dockless shared mobility, the shared bikes and scooters, is kind of baby steps towards connected and automated vehicles. We see the dockless scooters as the first large-scale connected vehicle fleets on the streets of Los Angeles right now. So what we're doing now is informing how we're going to approach connected and automated vehicles in the coming years, and that's everything from determining what kind of data that we want to collect from these systems and how we want to collect that data, how to collect real-time data, how to start integrating that with the data we have from other systems, including our vehicle traffic information from connected traffic signals from our transit systems, but also how do we start incentivizing shared use through these connected vehicles, whether that's through pricing or through regulations or through equity requirements in our permitting, and how we're going to start learning a lot from just how this program is kind of a really small scale version of it, how some of these strategies might work in the future.
I'm going to jump in because we're starting to run out of time. I
Yeah.
want to get a quick comment from Bird.
Yeah, I also wanted to point out that there are some very real transportation problems that we need to resolve now, which is how we get people out of cars for trips that shouldn't happen in cars. And so while we have conversations about what our future mobility system will look like, there's some real opportunities to set the stage, as we noted today, on solving some of those problems we're dealing with now.
I think, rather than my summary, we'll take one more question. And as you're coming up, the drive for data is good, but I think we tend to be, there is such a thing as too much data, and a lot of it not as useful as core data. And I think there is always that possibility of people just delving too deep in stuff that doesn't really make a difference. But
So I just, one quick thing I want to say, they did try the Trump AI in Arizona. You might have heard there was a crash, but the car started saying, "No collision, no collision."
I'm getting the really quickly, because it's my fault. One last question.
Great.
That's-
Thanks. Greg
I didn't
Burton,
think
I am one of those startups in the smart city, smart mobility space, and I'm also with the World Economic Forum, Future of Cities and Urbanization. Right. Big question here, transformational. How do all of the panelists think about pricing public assets and deriving value from those public assets in public-private partnerships with new mobility partners and the like, in a way to fund
Got it.
new mobility.
Everybody, 15 seconds on that question, please. Just go down that.
I think we need to have a conversation with cities about how we can reach common goals and what that looks like.
I think similar to what I was saying earlier about using our existing skills and tool set to approach these new modes, we'll start looking at things like right now we have places where we have dynamic parking prices on-street parking based on demand, and how do we start applying those kind of strategies to things like use of the curb, not just for parking, but for other shared services or automated vehicles, whatever's kind of to come in the future.
All right, Conan?
Yeah, we are pursuing some P3 projects just to try to leverage our opportunities and our assets to be able to get the private sector funding and the ability for them to basically construct and provide that service at a much faster rate.
Public-private partnerships are the way to solve a lot of things in the future. We don't do nearly enough of them. Metro, and way before Conan was there, has had a hard time getting on board with that, and that needs to change. And under Phil Washington, it is changing. But I think those are public-private partnerships give us much more latitude and much more opportunity. And last comment, something to keep in mind, I think, for all sorts of things, just because you can build it doesn't mean you should. And with that, thank you very much. We will end this session. Oh, I'm sorry. That was an announcement. The next session, conversation with the mayors, is in this room in 10 minutes. Thank you all very much.